court officer snaps at the old man. "Sir, you need to stop crying or leave my courtroom right now." 82-year-old Henry Walsh stands shaking as he holds his eviction papers, tears rolling down his face. Judge Miller actually laughs and turns to whisper something to his assistant while the crowded room stares at the crying veteran. None of them know that this broken old man once carried 6 wounded soldiers to safety through enemy fire in Vietnam. Smash that like button if you think this judge is about to learn a powerful lesson. Henry Walsh stood outside the courthouse steps, his worn hands gripping the metal railing. At 82 years old, his back was bent from decades of hard work, and his grey hair was neatly combed despite everything falling apart around him. He wore his only decent shirt and tie, the same ones he had worn to his wife Martha's funeral 3 years ago. The eviction notice in his jacket pocket felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Henry had lived in the same small apartment for 15 years ever since Martha passed and he could no longer afford their house. His monthly disability check barely covered rent, and when his medication costs went up, he fell behind on payments. Now he was here, hoping a judge might give him more time. The courtroom was packed with people waiting for their cases. Henry sat in the back row watching case after case get called. When his name was finally announced, his legs felt weak as he walked to the front. Judge Miller looked down at him with cold eyes and asked what his excuse was for not paying rent. Henry's voice cracked as he tried to explain about his medical bills and his fixed income. The words came out jumbled and desperate. Judge Miller interrupted him mid-sentence and said his sob story was not the court's problem. Henry felt tears starting to form and tried to wipe them away, but they kept coming. The stress of possibly losing his home, the shame of being in court, and the judge's harsh words all crashed down on him at once. His shoulders shook as he tried to control himself. That's when the court officer stepped forward and snapped at him to stop crying or leave the courtroom. Judge Miller actually started laughing and turned to his assistant to make a joke about crying old men. The sound of that laughter cut through Henry like a knife. People in the gallery began whispering and pointing at him. Some were shaking their heads in disgust at the judge's behavior, but others seemed amused by the spectacle. Henry felt completely alone and humiliated in that crowded room. The judge banged his gavel and told Henry he had 30 seconds to make. His case or the eviction would be final. Henry tried to speak, but his voice was too shaky. The laughter and whispers from the crowd made everything worse. He felt like he was back in those dark moments in Vietnam, when everything seemed hopeless, and death felt close. His hands trembled as he held onto the defendant's table for support. Judge Miller looked at his watch impatiently and started to speak again, ready to finalize the eviction. The bailiff moved closer to Henry, preparing to escort him out. The fuss. Whole room seemed to be against this broken old man who just wanted to keep his small apartment. Nobody cared about his story or his struggles. They just saw a crying elderly person taking up their time. Henry Walsh had enlisted in the army right out of high school in 1960. He was just 18 and thought military service would make him a man. Basic training was tough, but Henry pushed through because he wanted to serve his country. When he got deployed to Vietnam in 1965, he was assigned to Charlie Company as a medic. His job was to keep his fellow soldiers alive when bullets started flying. The worst day of his life came during a mission near the Mekong Delta. His unit walked into an ambush, and half his squad was cut down in the first few minutes. Henry crawled through mud and enemy fire for 3 straight days, dragging wounded soldiers to safety one by one. He saved 6 men that week, but lost 12 others despite his best efforts. The sounds of dying soldiers calling for their mothers still woke him up at night even 57 years later. Henry came home with a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart, but he never felt like a hero. Standing in that courtroom, Henry felt the same helplessness he had experienced in the jungle all those years ago. The judge's cruel laughter reminded him of the enemy soldiers who used to mock American prisoners. He thought about Martha, and how she used to tell him that his service meant something, that saving those 6 lives made all the pain worth it. But right now, none of that seemed to matter. Henry closed his eyes and could almost hear the helicopter blades from Vietnam. He remembered carrying Sergeant Rodriguez on his back for 2 miles while enemy soldiers shot at them from the trees. Rodriguez was only 19 and kept asking Henry if he was going to die. Henry had promised him he would make it home to see his baby daughter. And he did make it home, because Henry refused to give up on him. But now Henry felt like giving up on himself. Maybe he was just a burden to everyone. Maybe it would be easier to just accept the eviction and find somewhere else to go, even though he had nowhere to go. The shame of being laughed at in front of all these strangers was almost too much to bear. He wondered if any of the men he saved in Vietnam would recognize him now, broken down and crying in a courtroom. The memories of Martha holding his hand during his nightmares came flooding back. She always told him he was stronger than he knew. She said the same man who saved 6 soldiers could handle anything life threw at him. But Martha was gone now, and Henry felt completely alone in the world. All he wanted was to keep the small apartment where he still felt close to her memory. Judge Miller was about to bang his gavel and finalize the eviction when Henry found his voice again. He started talking about his military service, hoping it might make a difference. But the judge cut him off and said everyone claims to be a war hero when they want sympathy. The words hit Henry like a physical blow. Several people in the gallery gasped at the judge's disrespect. Henry pulled out his wallet and showed his military ID card, but Judge Miller waved it away without looking. He said fake military cards were easy to get online these days. The accusation that Henry was lying about his service was the final insult. His face turned red with a mixture of shame and anger that he had not felt in decades. The court officer moved even closer to Henry, clearly preparing to remove him from the courtroom. Judge Miller started lecturing Henry about personal responsibility and how his generation always expected handouts. Each word made the situation worse. Henry's breathing became shallow and fast. His chest started to hurt from the stress and humiliation. Some people in the gallery were now openly criticizing the judge's behavior, but Miller ignored them completely. He seemed to enjoy having power over this vulnerable old man. The landlord's lawyer looked uncomfortable, but said nothing to defend Henry. Everyone in that room was watching this elderly veteran get completely destroyed by a system that was supposed to protect people like him. Henry felt dizzy and grabbed the table harder to keep from falling. The shame was overwhelming. He started thinking about Martha again and how disappointed she would be to see him like this. All those years of military service, all those lives he saved, all the nightmares he endured. And this is what it came to. Being mocked and dismissed by a judge who had probably never risked anything for anyone else. The tension in the room was thick as Judge Miller prepared to deliver his final verdict. Henry's legs felt like they might give out completely. The bailiff had his hand on Henry's shoulder, ready to escort him out in front of everyone. It seemed like this was really the end for the old veteran. Just as Judge Miller raised his gavel to make the eviction final, the courtroom doors burst open with a loud bang. Everyone turned to see who was entering so dramatically. A tall man in a crisp military uniform walked in with purpose and authority. His chest was covered with ribbons and medals, and his presence immediately commanded respect from everyone in the room. The officer strode directly toward the front of the courtroom, his boots clicking on the floor with each step. Judge Miller looked confused and slightly annoyed at the interruption. The officer stopped right in front of Henry and snapped to attention with a perfect military salute. The entire courtroom fell completely silent as they watched this scene unfold. The officer spoke in a clear, strong voice that carried to every corner of the room. He introduced himself as Colonel Martinez from the Veterans Affairs Office and said he was there representing Sergeant Henry Walsh. He told the court that Henry was a decorated combat veteran who had saved multiple lives during his service in Ta Dinh, Vietnam. The colonel had Henry's complete military record in his hand and began reading his commendations aloud. Colonel Martinez explained that Henry had received the Bronze Star for valor under fire and the Purple Heart for wounds received in sea combat. He described how Henry had single-handedly saved 6 wounded soldiers during a 3-day battle, crawling through enemy territory while under constant fire. The colonel's voice grew stronger as he detailed each act of heroism that Henry had performed decades ago. Judge Miller's face went completely pale as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. The colonel continued speaking, explaining that Henry's financial troubles were directly related to his service-connected disabilities and medical needs. He said the Veterans Affairs Office would be taking over Henry's case and ensuring he received all the benefits he was entitled to. The colonel then turned to face Judge Miller directly and said that disrespecting veterans was unacceptable in any courtroom. His words were measured but carried the weight of absolute authority. Several people in the gallery started clapping, and soon the entire room was applauding Henry. The old veteran stood straighter than he had in years, tears still flowing but now for completely different reasons. Colonel Martinez announced that the VA would be paying Henry's back rent immediately and helping him apply for additional housing assistance. He said Henry would never have to worry about eviction again because of his service to his country. The transformation in the courtroom was complete and powerful. Judge Miller stammered an apology and immediately dismissed the eviction case. His earlier arrogance was completely gone, replaced by obvious embarrassment and regret. The landlord's lawyer quickly agreed to accept the VA's payment plan and withdrew all legal action against Henry. What had seemed like certain disaster just minutes before was now completely resolved. Henry wiped his eyes and stood as straight as his old back would allow. Colonel Martinez helped him gather his papers and walked with him toward the courtroom exit. The crowd of spectators parted respectfully as they passed, many of them offering words of thanks and appreciation for Henry's service. The contrast with how he had been treated just moments before was striking and emotional. Outside the courthouse, Colonel Martinez explained that the VA had been looking for Henry for months to inform him about expanded benefits he was eligible for. A computer error had caused his file to be misfiled, which was why he had not been receiving his full disability payments. The colonel apologized on behalf of the entire system and promised that Henry would receive everything he was owed. Henry learned that his monthly payments would increase significantly and that his medical expenses would be fully covered going forward. The colonel also arranged for him to receive home care assistance and transportation to medical appointments. For the first time in years, Henry felt secure about his future and his ability to remain in his apartment near Martha's memory. Sanor. Local newspaper picked up the story of what happened in the courtroom that day. Judge Miller faced criticism for his treatment of the elderly veteran and was required to attend sensitivity training. The story also brought attention to other veterans who were struggling with similar issues, leading to improvements in how the VA tracked and assisted older veterans in need. That evening, Henry sat in his small apartment looking at the photograph of Martha on his kitchen table. He told her about his day and how scared he had been in that courtroom, but he also told her about Colonel Martinez and how the whole room had applauded his service. For the first time since her death, Henry felt proud of himself again. He thought about the 6 soldiers he had saved in Vietnam and wondered if any of them were still alive. Maybe they had children and grandchildren who were living good lives because their father or grandfather had made it home from the war. Henry realized that his service had mattered then, and it still mattered now, even when judges and bureaucrats forgot to show proper respect. The next morning brought phone calls from other veterans who had heard about his story. They wanted to thank him and share their own struggles with the system. Henry found himself becoming an advocate for elderly veterans, working with Colonel Martinez to identify others who needed help. His experience in that courtroom, as painful as it had been, ended up helping many other people who had served their country. Henry kept the newspaper clipping about his case on his refrigerator as a reminder that every person's service and sacrifice deserves recognition and respect. He learned that sometimes you have to stand up for yourself, even when it feels impossible. Most importantly, he understood that Martha had been right all along. The same strength that helped him save lives in Vietnam was still inside him, waiting to be called upon when needed most. The old veteran's story became a powerful reminder that heroes walk among us every day, often unrecognized and struggling with problems that seem impossible to solve. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up and speak the truth to change everything. Henry Walsh had served his country with honor decades ago, and now his country was finally serving him with the respect and dignity he had always deserved.